When you have Coca-Cola sponsoring Copenhagen, the corporate identity of Copenhagen, okay, of the international climate negotiations, and when you have Coca-Cola talking about climate justice, there's a big freaking problem. Now, climate justice, what is the history of climate justice? Who coined the term climate justice? Well, I'm pleased to say, and you might have a different opinion, my boss, that's who coined it. My boss, Tom Goldtooth, has been widely recognized as the dude who coined the term climate justice back in the day. And in 2002, IEN was part of a large group of NGOs representing different regions across Mother Earth that participated in the preparatory conference to the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Bali. I was a part of that, and we had a meeting on climate justice there where we came up with the Bali Principles of Climate Justice, which clearly define the parameters and the definition that impacted communities in the global south, but also in the developed north, okay? Indigenous peoples, communities of color, and other marginalized, disproportionately impacted communities. And we came up and defined what is the climate justice movement for ourselves, okay? And so I'm here to tell you that, yes, climate justice has to do with probably its most shallow definition, which is ecological debt owed to the South by industrialized countries in terms of, per capita accumulated contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere. But I think more importantly, climate justice is a movement that is led by, okay, in other words, politically empowered, representatives of communities from the global south, of indigenous communities, and other disproportionately affected communities. And that's a really important thing to understand, okay? Because the co-optation in Copenhagen of the term climate justice by the mainstream, well-funded, environmental movement, by industry, by, all of these different interest groups was highly problematic. There was 100 passes given to civil society. The Indigenous Peoples Caucus, okay, the official instrument for Indigenous peoples to participate in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now we're talking about elected leaders, okay, democratically elected Indigenous leaders of sovereign nations, okay? You know how many passes we got? There were 300 of us there. We got 12. And so, we had to divide that up 2 per region. Globally, there's 7 regions, and it was an interesting situation where you have, representatives of environmental organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund in the United States, who are, big-time pro-carbon traders, really advocating a lot of what we feel are false solutions that are actually going to exacerbate the on-the-ground human rights crisis and impacts that we're facing as frontline impacted communities. They could get into the high-level negotiations, but elected leaders of sovereign nations couldn't. And this is why I mean when I say that, it's really important that there's some basic fundamental principles to how we need to approach, the climate crisis, in particular advocacy around it. And one of the most critical things, I think, is that, communities must speak for themselves. I think far too often, there's a lot of people that, have good intentions, but quite often, they're really out of touch with the needs of locally affected frontline communities. And this is a power dynamic that needs to be addressed, as we move forward, in particular with climate justice organizing here in Toronto. We need to build a culture where we're empowering, communities that carry the greatest burden, but that have contributed the least to the climate crisis, okay? We've got to make sure that they're leading this movement, that they're the ones that need to be speaking for themselves on the issues and advocating for the policy changes. Because I think one of the things that we've seen in Copenhagen, on the road to Copenhagen, during Copenhagen, and that we continue to see after, is this bizarre, weird amnesia in activism, in terms of how does social change happen? How do we create systemic change? And, bottom line, it comes from building social movements, activism, getting involved, building a political base, community organizing, making sure that, you have a strong political base to inform the interventions, whether that's a policy intervention, a litigation, or whatever, okay? But having the strong political base to make sure that your movement, has the power to move. And so for us at IEN, one of the things that we really were encouraged to see coming out of Copenhagen was the fact that really a lot of allies, that have, what could be viewed as power, took a step back. When on December 12th, the big global day of action, 100,000 people marched in the streets of Copenhagen. 100,000 people. And the organizers of the march took a step back and they said, we want this march to be led by the world's indigenous peoples, which was a profound statement, and it was beautiful. I mean, and even like Greenpeace and others, they were behind us, and typically that doesn't happen, okay? And so it was extremely symbolic that indigenous peoples of the world led the global People's March for Action. What we wanted to do was to welcome Prime Minister Harper to Copenhagen and to empower Prime Minister Harper with the legal documents to make a strong legally binding commitment. So we actually rolled out a huge welcome mat in front of the embassy and presented a basket full of all of the treaties that Canada has yet to honor in terms of the native treaties in this country. Treaties 1 through 11. We provided a copy of the Kyoto Protocol, and we also provided a copy of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we also did the same thing with the US. We did a big action on the US Embassy, presented them with a scroll or a declaration from Native American communities. A lot of groups, strategically, tactfully, have not called out President Obama yet. But we made the decision to call out the Obama administration. As we heard last night in the State of the Union address, I mean, he's pretty much full on gone out. I mean, the gloves are off. I'm sorry. Because where the offshore oil and gas development is happening, that's going to destroy the lives, the cultural way of life of Inupiaq people that have subsisted off of the marine life in that fragile ice edge ecosystem in the North Slope of Alaska for time immemorial. Their way of life will be destroyed. It's already unraveling at unprecedented rates due to the global warming effects that are happening on the North Slope. It's Canada's tar sands. Dozens of communities, not just Native communities, but Métis communities and rural non-Native communities as well, being affected by this devastating development. A quarter of North America's fresh water is at stake with this development. Catastrophic climate change, 170 million tons of carbon CO2 coming out of tar sands by 2030 if we don't stop that beast. We need to advocate, a human rights-based approach to how we develop a new green economy. Okay, we need to make sure that communities are leading and speaking for themselves on these issues. Okay, we have a moral responsibility to frame climate change as the civil rights issue of our generation. The environmental racism, okay, the systemic racism that plays out in Canada that makes it okay for the Canadian government to say, 100 people in Fort Chipewyan can die from cancer and autoimmune deficiencies in the last 10 years, that's okay, is environmental racism. It's straight up racism, okay? And it's screwed up. If you applied the same statistics of mortality that Fort Chipewyan is experiencing as a result of living downstream from Canada's tar sands to, say, Toronto, you would have dozens, if not hundreds, of square blocks of dead people. Okay? 100 people out of 1,200 citizens dead from cancers and autoimmune deficiency syndromes in 10 years. It's staggering. We strongly encourage all of you to not get caught up in this whole thing of political realism. Okay? Political realism will result in passive acts of violence against future generations of Canadians and First Nations peoples yet to be born. Did Gandhi fall into political realism? Did Martin Luther King buy into political reality or realism? Hell no, Neither did Sitting Bull or Tecumseh or any of our great First Nations leaders. We have got to build a profound social movement in Canada. It's already happening. I think the 60 rallies against prologuing of the government by Prime Minister Harper are a perfect example of indicators that there is a social movement of profound and epic proportions happening in this country. And the reality of it is we have an amazing opportunity to build a new economic paradigm for our people, okay? To share, the abundance that is the land, the resources, the sacred interconnection of Mother Earth. We have an opportunity to share that, in a way that, and to take care of it, for future generations.